entered into the court palace just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner courtyard, he welcomed her, holding out the gold scepter to her. He had to hold out the gold scepter first in order to allow anyone to come in. You can't just waltz into the king. So Esther approached and touched its tip. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." You know what her request is now, don't you? And Esther replied, "If it please your majesty, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." The king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Esther replied, "This is my request and deepest wish. If your majesty is pleased with me and wants to grant my request, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then tomorrow I will explain what this is all about." What a happy man Haman was as he left the banquet. When he saw Mordecai sitting at the gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, he was furious. However, he restrained himself and went home. And he gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the officials and leaders. And Haman added, "And that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow." Then he added, But all this is meaningless as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the palace gate." Well, if only he knew who Queen Esther really was. Right? So Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends suggested set up a gallows that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to hang Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman immensely, and he ordered the gallows set up. That night the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the historical records of his kingdom so they could be read to him. And in these records he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, the two eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate the king. "What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this?" the king asked. His attendants replied, "Nothing has been done." "Who is that in the outer court?" the king inquired. Now as it happened, Mordecai was out in the outer court. Now as it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to hang Mordecai from the gallows he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, "Haman is out there. Bring him in," the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, What should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me?" Haman thought to himself, "Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" So he replied, "If the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as the king's own horse with a royal emblem on its head. Instruct one of the king's most noble princes to dress the man in the king's robe and to lead him through the city square on the king's own horse. Have the prince shout as they go, 'This is what happens to those the king wishes to honor.'" "Excellent," the king said to Haman. Little did he know who he's going to be honoring. "Hurry and get the robe and my horse, and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Do not fail to carry out everything you have suggested." How is he going to get the king to hang him now? So Haman took the robe and put it on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, "This is what happens to those who the king wishes to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. When Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends what had happened, they said, "Since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is a Jew, you will never succeed in your plan against him. It will be fatal to continue to oppose him. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived to take Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went to the Queen Esther's banquet. And while they were drinking wine that day, the king again asked her, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." And so Queen Esther replied, "If your majesty is pleased with me and wants to grant my request, my petition is that my life and the lives of my people be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had only been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would have been a matter too trivial to warrant to disturbing the king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would dare touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. And the king jumped to his feet in rage and went out into the palace garden. But Haman stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that he was doomed. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king returned from the palace garden. "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" the king roared. And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. And Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a gallows that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to hang Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then hang Haman on it," the king ordered. So they hanged Haman on the gallows, and he set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger was pacified. And the rest of the story is that Esther petitioned the king to reverse the orders to have all the Jews killed, and he did. And Mordecai became the prime minister in his place, in Haman's place. And they also asked the king for the power to have power over their enemies, and they did, and they actually slew all of Haman's sons and all those who opposed them, and many thousands had died, and the Jews had great freedom. It's a pretty interesting story, actually, the story of Esther. Actually a good story. Yeah. So we'll go back to Mark 6. Mark 6, verse 24. And after going out, she said to her mother, "What shall I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." And she immediately returned to the king with haste and said, "I desire that you give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Oof, what a hideous thing. Matthew 14, verse 8. Then being urged by her mother hated John. She said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." And the king was grieved. The king really didn't want to do that because he feared the people. And his rule, his power is more important than his wife. But he had made that promise. Whatever you ask, even if it is half my kingdom. Now how could he make a promise like that before all those guests and not come through on it? If she had requested, "I'll take half your kingdom," no, that wasn't expected. That was not a reasonable request. This was, for lack of a better word, a reasonable request. Having a man beheaded being reasonable, that's not reasonable. But the king had no choice. He had to have this done. But because of the oaths and those who were sitting with him, he commanded that it be given. There was nothing he could do about it. And he sent and he beheaded John. in the prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother. And what did her mother do with it? Who knows? In the story we see in some of the biblical movies, why don't you just look at it? Creepy. Mark 6, verse 26. Now, although the king was personally very sorrowful because of the oaths and those who were sitting with him, he would not reject her request. Then without delay the king sent a guardsman and ordered his head to be brought. And he went and he beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the young woman. And the young woman gave it to her mother. In Matthew 14, verse 12, then his disciples came, and they took the body and buried it. And they went and told Jesus. In Mark 6, verse 29, and when his disciples heard of it, they came and they took up his body, and they laid it in a tomb. I think that's a good place to end this one today, actually. Okay? Be a shorter one.